So just running through some of the key concepts within complexity, complex systems and the rest of it. So the first is this idea of emergence. That we have local interactions, whether they be ants or swarming birds or people in a market, and that through that process of interaction you create a structure. The structure might be that big swarm of birds that you see. It might be how a market functions. It might be the anthill or that you see, or the termite mound you see there. And I think the important thing about this is it is hard. We'll come on to that, the prediction thing. But the important thing here is that actually a lot of myriad interactions create something. The practices create something bigger, and we see that in informal institutions in terms of attitudes to gender, attitudes to hierarchy, etc. And in sociology, in economics, these terms are used quite often. And often you'll see agency and structure is the way that is framed in that Krasnarich paper that I'm sure you also read. And if you like, these can be the actors doing stuff that then create a structure of rules, of institutions, etc. The difference between this and a kind of a linear problem tree is that root causes and outcomes are actually in a much more complex interaction. Root causes don't stop like they do in a problem tree. They are actually linked back into the outcomes.
So, sorry, just clarify that. So you're saying that the structure contributes to the local interaction as much as it's created by it?
Correct. And the idea is that your structure actually constrains the ability of you to do certain things. So that might be your institutions of marriage, for example, might constrain the ability of agents to get married. But those actors can change that structure through processes of influence and change. And those two are in constant iteration. The second element of this is that uncertainty and prediction are very hard. And in part that's because, I used to have a boss like this. And I was always the one saying that sort of thing as well. You've just made that up. Do you remember, Chris? Mm-hmm. The important thing here is that one reason why emergent behaviour is hard to predict is because the number of interactions that we're talking about in a market or a flight of birds or numbers of ants, but there are probably simple rules that guide that. And the number of components in a system, once you've got more numbers, the interactions rise exponentially. So the number of possibilities of outcomes actually increase. And it's different from risk. Keynes made a big distinction between risk and uncertainty. In risk, one could calculate the probability of a risk, whereas uncertainty, one can't. And interestingly, it's the Bank of England, following the global financial crisis, reckoned that that part of their problem is that they tried to quantify risk according to a particular model, as opposed to thinking about uncertainty. And the governor of the Bank of England, his conclusion was he needed more diversity on the board to look at how uncertainty might play out, as opposed to a very specialist group of economists who could do risk analysis in a very quantified manner, which was a very narrow take on the wood. And I'm sure you've probably all seen the Cynefin framework. Have you? Hands up. Cynefin framework, everybody? Okay. So David Snowden, Welsh bloke who invented Cynefin as a name because he was in Japan, and the Japanese had a nice name for their model and framework. So he's from Wales, so he chose Cynefin. That's why we end up with this name. But his argument is the following: that in certain contexts we have simple systems where cause and effect relationships are clear. They're predictable, and in this domain, best practice is possible. So and Duncan talks about baking a cake. It's not his idea. The idea that you get your recipe right, you put it in the oven, you get well, I don't, but most people get a reasonable cake out of that. It's relatively simple. You follow a recipe at best practice. The complicated space, cause and effect is knowable, but you require expert judgment to use it. The metaphor that is often used there is taking a rocket to the moon. It's hard, and you need some quite good experts. It is rocket science, but you can do it. And in these domains, expert judgment is important, and one senses the problem, analyse it, and then respond. So this is sometimes known as the domain of good practice, not best practice. The complex domain is where cause and effect relationships are not repeatable. They're different every time. And this is more like, some suggest, raising a child. It depends on the child. Each child is different, and what you do, you might get a different reaction. And in this domain, you probe, you test, and you do stuff and get a response and see what you do. It's that you test and experiment. This is the domain of emergent practice. And finally, the chaotic domain, there's a fire in the room, get out, get in another box. That's the domain of response, act, sense, and then respond. So I think what's useful about this, it gives us different ways of contextualizing, thinking about different types of contexts, different types of programs, different types of things, and thinking about this. Because I think the problem is either what we do is we put everything in this box and think nothing can be thought through adequate analysis or the rest of it, or we try and put everything in this box and KPI it to death, and then that emergent practice doesn't happen. So that's another way of thinking about unpredictability and how to manage it. Critical junctures and tipping points, and this notion is important about non-linear change. So Malcolm I don't know if everyone's read Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point. Great airport read if you're on a flight, and his story about hush puppies. So hush puppies went out of fashion. Suddenly some nerd in New York went out to a party wearing his dad's hush puppies. He was at the forefront of a new movement of the return of the hush puppy. And his argument was you had someone that broke the rules very early on and didn't care actually about fashion. That's why he was wearing his granddad's shoes or his dad's shoes. But following him were a bunch of connectors and mavens, as he called them, that played the role of helping that idea spread. And then once it reached a certain point, suddenly everybody wanted hush puppies. Now you combine this with uncertainty. It's why some people compare our approach to climate change as the equivalent of driving in the fog at 70 kilometres an hour when it is likely the road ends in a cliff somewhere in the next few kilometres. Because we don't know when and how tipping points will occur, and they could be very dramatic. And it's not as if the climate system is always in equilibrium like an economic system isn't. It can tip into a new phase. So this is, I think, a useful concept. It's also useful because in critical junctures and tipping points, systems become more freed up. So the fact that women get recruited into munitions factories during the war is in part because of that juncture has loosened up gender norms. And that then produces a change that is then, in that case, sustained over time with women actually working in the factory. So this notion of critical junctures is helpful as well. Path dependency. Now, who knows about the Dvorak keyboard? Because I've only very recently heard of it. My understanding of this, so correct me if I'm wrong, Brendan, is the Dvorak keyboard would be the most efficient keyboard we could use if we wanted to. On a computer, yeah, or on a typewriter. But my understanding of the problem was with QWERTY was invented when we had those those hand typewriters, whatever. Manual, that's one. And your keys would get stuck, and QWERTY was designed to make the keys not jam, is my understanding. But we don't use typewriters anymore like that. We use computers and have done for 30, 40 years. Yet, we stick with QWERTY because the costs of transferring to Dvorak, everybody already knows QWERTY. All the machines in the world are QWERTY machines. Well, in the English-speaking world, pardon me. But we stick with it. So this notion of context and history, if we need sometimes to go back to understand why something is in place, because just looking at it in the current phase doesn't explain why it stayed there, even when it might look like it's inefficient or stupid. And I think it plays into the idea of why you might have external actors might have good ideas and they don't work. Now, Duncan also talks about evolutionary dynamics. Now, evolutionary economists, behavioral evolutionists, cognitive psychologists are all using variations on notions of adaptation and evolution. And it's also become a means to understand social and political phenomena, from conflict to political institutions, technological change, economic growth. And the key notion here really is one of trial and error, attempts to try out things in different combinations. Now, I think the big question for those people who are interested in development is this just a metaphor for how development happens? It clearly happens in biology, but is this just a useful metaphor for understanding how things happen, or is it this really more useful? Because arguably, the whole point of evolutionary stuff is you have random mutations. And you can't predict that randomness, and can you manage randomness? So there's quite the debate at the moment about these concepts. Are they just useful as metaphors for thinking about change, or are they actually practically useful for doing stuff? So that's complexity.